Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with a story about what medieval servants really thought of their lords, the truth behind the quiet glances, whispered words, and long days spent serving in the shadows of great halls. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for a bit of background hum, and let's travel back together into the quiet, candlelit world of medieval service and loyalty. You might think that memory fades with age, that the years smooth away the sharp edges of what once was, but I tell you this, I can still feel the cold of that November morning when I first walked through the gates of Ashford Hall. I was 14 years of age, my father's third son, and there was no land for me, no trade learned, nothing but a letter of commendation written by the village priest, and my mother's instructions ringing in my ears. Keep your head down. The house rose before me like a mountain of stone. I'd never seen anything so vast. Our village church could have fit twice over in the great hall alone, or so it seemed to my country eyes. The walls were the colour of storm clouds, the windows narrow as knife cuts, and smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys into the grey sky. I stood at the gate with my bundle of clothes pressed against my chest, and I felt something I would feel every day for the next 40 years. I felt small. A man came to fetch me. His name was Geoffrey, and he was the under-steward, though I did not know what that meant then. He looked me up and down as one might examine a horse at market, checking my teeth without touching me, measuring the width of my shoulders, noting the mud on my shoes. He said nothing kind. He said nothing cruel. He simply turned and walked, and I followed, because that is what you do when you have nowhere else to go. The first thing that struck me was the smell. Not unpleasant, but overwhelming in its strangeness. Wood smoke, yes, and the familiar scent of animals and hay, but also things I had no names for then. Beeswax and tallow, the sweetness of dried herbs hanging in bunches, the bitter tang of lye soap, the richness of roasting meat even at that early hour, and underneath it all, the smell of stone itself, cold and ancient and damp. The house breathed its own air, different from the fields and forests I had known. Geoffrey led me through passages that turned and twisted, past doors I would later learn by heart, through the kitchens where fires already burned though dawn had barely broken, down steps worn smooth by generations of feet, and finally into a small chamber where 6 pallets lay on the floor. "This is where you sleep," he said. "The privy is in the yard. You wash at the well. Meals are after the family has eaten. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not enter the solar unless summoned. You do not touch what is not yours to touch. Do you understand?" I said that I did, though I understood nothing yet. He left me there, and I sat on the pallet that would be mine, and I looked at my hands. They were farmers' hands, rough and broad, with dirt still beneath the nails despite my mother's scrubbing. I did not know then that these hands would carry silver plate worth more than my father's entire holding, that they would pour wine that cost more than a year of labour, that they would fold linen finer than anything my family had ever owned. I did not know that I would learn to make these hands invisible, to move them in service as though they belonged not to me, but to the house itself. The other boys came in throughout the morning. There were 5 of them, ranging from 12 to 17 years, and they looked at me with neither welcome nor hostility, only a kind of weary assessment. The youngest was called Peter, a scullery boy with burn marks on his forearms. The eldest was William, who worked in the stables and spoke little. They told me what I needed to know in short, flat sentences, where to stand during meals, how to address the chamberlain, which stairs creaked and should be avoided when carrying things, where the good bread was kept and where the mouldy, which Geoffrey would notice if you took and which he would not. That first day, I was set to work in the scullery. Do you know what that means? It means standing in water that never quite warmed, scrubbing pots with sand and ashes until your hands split and bled, though we did not call it that then. We called it what happens when you work. The cook was a woman named Agnes, broad as a barrel and sharp as the knives she kept. She did not speak to me except to tell me when I had done something wrong, which was often. Too slow. More sand. That one still has grease. Again. I scrubbed until my shoulders burned. I scrubbed until the light outside the small window shifted from grey to greyer. I scrubbed until I could no longer feel my fingers except as distant aching things attached to my wrists. And when I finally finished the last pot, when I thought I might rest, Agnes pointed to the floor. "Now that," she said. The floor was covered in scraps of food, spilled fat, tracked mud, and things I preferred not to examine closely. I knelt and began to scrub, using the same sand and the same cold water, and I understood something then that would stay with me. The work was never finished. There was no moment when you could stand back and say, "It is done." There was only the next task, and the one after that, and the one after that, stretching forward into a future I could not yet imagine. I ate my first meal in that house sitting on the floor of the scullery after everyone else had finished. It was bread and pottage, the bread hard and the pottage thin, but I was so hungry I barely tasted it. Peter sat beside me, picking at his food. He asked where I was from. I told him. He nodded as though this meant something. Then he said, "You will get used to it," and I did not know whether he meant the work or the hunger or something else entirely. That night, lying on my pallet in the dark, I listened to the sounds of the house settling around me, footsteps above, voices muffled by stone, the creak of wood and the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls. Somewhere, someone was coughing. Somewhere else, someone was praying. I pulled my thin blanket closer and thought of home, of my mother's face, of the fields I would not plough, and I felt a loneliness so profound it seemed to have weight pressing down on my chest like a stone. But I did not cry. Even then I knew that crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. The next morning began before dawn. I was woken by William shaking my shoulder, his face barely visible in the darkness. "Up," he said, "always up before the family wakes." We dressed in silence, fumbling with our clothes in the cold, and went out into the yard where frost glittered on the stones. The well water was so cold it made my teeth ache. We splashed our faces and hands, and then we went to work. I learned the rhythm of those early mornings, the lighting of fires, the fetching of water, the sweeping of passages, the preparation of the house for waking. We moved like ghosts through the grey light, trying to complete our tasks before the household stirred, trying to make everything clean and warm and ready without being seen or heard. Invisibility was the mark of good service. If they noticed you, it meant you had done something wrong. The family began to appear as the sun rose. I caught glimpses of them at first, nothing more. A lady's skirt disappearing around a corner, a lord's voice raised in some command I could not quite hear, children running past in a blur of fine wool and laughter. They existed in a different world, one that overlapped with ours but did not touch it, as though we all inhabited the same house but lived in different kingdoms. My first proper sight of Lord Ashford came 3 days after my arrival. I was carrying firewood through the passage near the great hall when he emerged from a doorway, and I nearly dropped my burden in surprise. He was not a large man, neither tall nor broad, but he carried himself as though he owned the very air he breathed. His clothes were finer than anything I had ever seen, a surcoat of deep blue wool trimmed with fur, a belt worked with silver, boots of soft leather that came to his knees. But it was his face that struck me most. It was a handsome face, I suppose, clean-shaven and well-formed, but it had a quality I had not encountered before, a kind of smoothness, as though life had never truly marked him, as though worry and want had never carved lines into his features as they had into every face I had known. He looked at me, or rather, his eyes passed over me as they might pass over a piece of furniture, noting my presence without truly seeing me. Then he walked on, and I stood there holding my firewood, and I felt something I could not name. Not quite anger, not quite shame. Something in between, something that tasted bitter in the back of my throat. Over the following weeks I began to understand the architecture of the household, its invisible structure as complex as the visible one. There was a hierarchy among the servants as strict as that among the nobles, and your place in it determined everything. What you ate, where you slept, what tasks you performed, whether you were addressed by name or simply ordered about like livestock. At the top stood Robert the Chamberlain, a thin man with grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He managed the household with precision and without mercy. Beneath him was Geoffrey the understeward, then the cooks and the head groom, then the body servants who attended the family directly, then those of us who did the rough work, and finally, at the very bottom, the scullery maids, and the boys who mucked out the stables. We all knew our place. We all kept to it. But knowing your place and accepting it are not the same thing. I worked. God, how I worked. My days began in darkness and ended in exhaustion. I hauled water and wood. I scrubbed floors and pots. I ran errands throughout the house and into the village. I held horses while knights mounted. I served at table, standing so still my legs trembled. I polished silver until my reflection stared back at me from surfaces that would be dirtied again within hours. My hands, which had been rough before, became something else entirely, cracked and calloused, the skin split at the knuckles, permanently stained with soot and soap. The work taught me things about myself I had not known. It taught me that I could bear more than I thought possible. It taught me that tiredness has many levels, and that you can function even when you believe you cannot take another step. It taught me that the body is stronger than the mind imagines, and more fragile than pride will admit. But it also taught me about the world, about the casual cruelty that lives in the gap between those who command and those who obey. I remember the day Richard, one of the stable boys, was disciplined for letting a horse go lame. He swore he had checked its hooves the night before, that there had been no stone, no injury, nothing amiss. It did not matter. The head groom took him to the yard and meted out correction with a leather strap, while the rest of us watched, because we were meant to watch, because the lesson was for all of us. Richard did not cry out, but his face went white, and afterward he could barely stand. We helped him to his pallet and said nothing, because what was there to say? This was the way of things. This was justice as we knew it. And yet, that same week, I saw Lord Ashford's youngest son, a boy of perhaps 9 years, deliberately strike a servant girl across the face with a riding crop because she had not moved out of his path quickly enough. She was perhaps 12, a laundress's daughter. The boy laughed. His tutor, who stood nearby, said nothing. The girl bent her head and hurried away, one hand pressed to her cheek, and I watched her go and felt something dark unfurl in my chest. That night, lying in the dark, I asked William about it. Why was the girl not defended? Why was the boy not corrected? William was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because he is the son, and she is nothing. That is all. Go to sleep." But I could not sleep. I lay there thinking about that girl's face, about the casual nature of the blow, about the laughter, and I began to understand something that would grow clearer with each passing year, that to those above us, we were not quite human in the way they were human. We had faces and names and families, yes, but we were fundamentally different in their eyes, made of coarser material, capable of less feeling, requiring less consideration. We were tools, and you did not apologize to tools. You might think this realization would have bred pure resentment. It did not. The human heart is more complicated than that. Because even as I understood our lowness, I was also learning to take a strange pride in the work itself, in the skill of good service. There is an art to serving at table, to moving silently and surely, to anticipating needs before they are spoken, to being present but not intrusive, to handling precious things with the care they require. There is satisfaction in cleaning something thoroughly, in seeing the dirt lift away and the true surface emerge. There is dignity in doing a task well, even a humble task, even a task no one will thank you for. I became good at my work. I learned quickly. I watched the older servants and copied their movements, their economy of motion, their ability to read a room and respond to its needs. Within 6 months, I was no longer the newest boy. Within a year, Geoffrey began to give me more responsibility. Within 2 years, I was sometimes allowed to serve in the great hall during feasts, standing behind the high table with a ewer of wine, trying not to let my hands shake as I poured for lords and ladies whose single rings cost more than everything my family owned. And here is the truth I am ashamed to admit. Part of me was proud to be there. Part of me felt elevated by proximity to their wealth and power, as though some of their luster might rub off on me, as though by serving them I became something more than I had been. This is what service does to you. It teaches you to measure your worth by their standards, to see yourself through their eyes, to take satisfaction in being a good servant rather than raging at being a servant at all. The seasons turned, and the work turned with them, constant and varied and unending. In winter, we battled the cold. The great hall had its enormous fires, the solar had its braziers, the family's chambers had warming pans filled with hot coals and passed between the sheets before bedtime. But the passages were like ice, the kitchens were draughty despite the cooking fires, and our sleeping chamber was so cold that frost formed on the inside of the walls. We slept in our clothes, 2 or 3 to a pallet for warmth, and woke with our breath clouding the air. The work of winter was the work of keeping warm, hauling endless loads of firewood from the stores, keeping the fires fed throughout the day and banked at night, dealing with frozen water in the wells, thawing what had frozen, warming what needed warming. Our hands were always cold. Our feet were always cold. You learned to work despite it, to move despite the stiffness in your joints, to ignore the ache in your bones. Spring brought different labours. The house was cleaned from top to bottom, every chamber aired, every piece of fabric taken out and beaten, every floor scrubbed until the stone showed through the accumulated grime of winter. Mattresses were emptied and restuffed. Walls were washed with lime. Windows were cleaned. It was brutal work, but there was something satisfying about it too, about the sense of renewal, of making things fresh again. Summer was the time of plenty, when food was abundant and the household swelled with visitors, knights and ladies, merchants and petitioners, relatives and hangers-on. The feasts grew more elaborate, the hunting parties more frequent, and our work multiplied accordingly. We served sometimes 50 or 60 people at table. We prepared chambers for guests, we washed mountains of linen. We ran ourselves ragged trying to maintain the appearance of effortless abundance. Autumn brought the harvest, and with it, the anxious calculation of what would be stored for winter. The household depended on the land, on the rents paid in grain and livestock, on the success or failure of the crops. A good harvest meant security. A poor one meant lean times ahead, less food for everyone, but especially for those of us at the bottom. Through all these seasons, the daily rhythm remained the same. You rose before dawn. You worked until dark. You ate when you could. You slept when you were allowed, and you did it again the next day, and the day after that, until the days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into years. Let me tell you what a day was like, a typical day, so you can understand the texture of that life. You woke in darkness, always in darkness, pulled from sleep by habit or by someone's hand on your shoulder. You rose from your pallet, your body aching in ways that became so familiar you stopped noticing them. The stiffness in your back, the pain in your knees, the soreness in your shoulders. You dressed by touch in the dark, fumbling with clothes that were never quite dry, never quite clean, that smelled of smoke and sweat and labour. Out to the well, where the water was cold enough to make you gasp, where you splashed your face and tried to wake fully, then to your tasks. If you were lucky, you could warm yourself by the kitchen fires while you worked. If not, you simply stayed cold. The kitchen in the early morning was a place of controlled chaos. Agnes and the other cooks moved with purpose, preparing the household's first meal. Bread was baked daily, the ovens fired and tended. Pottage was set to simmer, great pots of it that would feed servants and family alike, though the family's pottage would have meat and spices, while ours would be mostly grain, and whatever vegetables were available. Ale was drawn from barrels, small beer that was safer than water, and formed part of our daily ration. While the cooks worked, the rest of us made the house ready. Fires were laid and lit in every chamber that would be used that day. Passages were swept. The great hall was prepared for breaking fast. The family's chambers were tended, chamber pots emptied and cleaned. We called it the daily necessity. Wash water brought, clothes laid out. I learned early that the intimate work of the household, the handling of bodily necessities, was given to specific servants who were trusted for their discretion. There was no shame in this work, not among us, for we all understood that everyone, high or low, produces the same waste, requires the same cleaning. But it was work that made you understand very clearly the lie of nobility, that these people who claimed to be made of finer stuff than us were subject to the same base functions, the same animal needs. The family rose later than we did, naturally. We would hear them stirring, hear the sounds of their waking filtered through walls and floors. The children were often loud, their nurses scolding them gently. Lord Ashford was quieter, his morning routines conducted with efficiency. Lady Ashford sometimes lay abed until mid-morning, and we would have to keep her chambers warm and ready, not knowing exactly when she would emerge. When they came to break their fast in the hall, we served them. This was a skill that took months to learn properly. The choreography of service, the precise movements required to place dishes, pour drinks, clear plates without disrupting conversation, without drawing attention to yourself. You learned to read gestures, to understand what a raised finger meant, what a glance indicated. You learned to be present but invisible, a contradiction that somehow we managed. After the morning meal, the day's work truly began. For the family, this might mean estate business, or letters to be written, or lessons for the children, or needlework for the ladies, or riding out to hunt or visit neighbours. For us, it meant labour of every description. I might be sent to the village with messages. I might work in the stores, checking inventory and bringing up what was needed. I might help in the stables, not with the fine horses, but with the work horses and pack animals. I might polish silver or clean leather or run errands between different parts of the household. The work varied, but it was always work, always necessary, always urgent. The midday meal was simpler than the morning one, and we servants often ate ours standing quickly, whatever could be grabbed from the kitchens, bread and cheese, cold meat if there was any, pottage, small beer. It was enough to keep you working, but rarely enough to feel truly satisfied. The afternoon stretched long, filled with more of the same labour, and always there was the awareness of time, of tasks that needed to be completed before the evening meal, of preparations that had to be made, of the ever-present possibility that you would be called upon to drop what you were doing and attend to some new demand. The evening meal was the grand affair, especially if there were guests. The great hall would be set with the finest plate, the best linens, candles and torches to light the space. The family and their guests would feast while we served, and afterward we would eat what remained, standing in the kitchens or sitting on benches in the passage, too tired to care much about the taste of the food. After the meal came the cleaning, the endless cleaning. Every dish had to be washed, every pot scrubbed, every surface wiped down. The hall had to be swept and readied for the next day. The family's chambers had to be prepared for night. Fires banked, bed warmers filled and passed through the sheets. Everything made comfortable and safe for their sleeping. Only when all this was done could we ourselves rest. Back to our chamber, to our pallets, to a sleep that was never quite long enough. And then it began again. This was the rhythm, day after day, week after week, year after year. You might ask, did we never have rest? Did we never have time for ourselves? The answer is complicated. Officially, we had Sundays and holy days when work was meant to cease. In practice, a household this size never truly stopped. Animals needed tending, fires needed maintaining, people needed feeding. The work continued, only slightly diminished. But yes, on Sundays we attended Mass in the chapel, standing at the back while the family sat in their carved pews at the front. The priest spoke of humility and obedience, of accepting one's station in life as ordained by God, of the virtue of suffering and the rewards that awaited the faithful in heaven. I listened to these words and tried to find comfort in them, tried to believe that my labour had meaning beyond the immediate, that I was part of some greater design. Sometimes I succeeded. Sometimes the words rang hollow. On feast days there were small pleasures, extra food, a bit of ale that was less watered, Perhaps some entertainment, travelling musicians or a storyteller, watched from the edges of the hall. These moments were bright spots, brief respites from the endless grind. And there were other small pleasures too, found in the margins of the days. The camaraderie of the other servants, the jokes shared in quiet moments, the small kindnesses we showed each other. Peter teaching me a song his mother had taught him. William showing me how to calm a nervous horse. Agnes saving me a bit of honey cake when she thought no one was looking. These things mattered. They kept us human. But I do not want to paint too gentle a picture. The work was hard, and it hardened us. We learned to endure, but endurance came at a cost. Some servants became mean, taking out their frustrations on those below them. Some became obsequious, fawning to those above in hopes of favour. Some became hollow, going through the motions with dead eyes and empty hearts. I tried to hold on to something better. I tried to maintain a core of self beneath the layers of servitude. I cannot say I always succeeded. There were losses along the way. Peter was sent home after 2 years, unable to keep up with the work after a fever left him weakened. We never heard from him again. A kitchen maid named Joan was dismissed for stealing food, though we all knew she had been taking it to feed her younger siblings in the village. One of the stable boys was injured when a horse kicked him, and though he survived, he walked with a terrible limp afterward, and was relegated to the meanest tasks. And there were worse fates, though we do not speak of them often. Servants who fell ill and were removed to die elsewhere. Girls who found themselves with child and were sent away in disgrace, though we all knew it was not always their choice how such things happened. Men who were found to have broken some rule or offended some noble, and were shown the consequences of such transgressions, discipline that left them changed. These things hung over us like shadows. We were never safe, not truly. Our lives depended on the whims of those above us, on their moods, their mercy, their sense of justice or injustice, and yet we continued. What else could we do? Let me tell you about the people I served, about what they looked like from below, from the position of one who saw them daily but was never truly seen by them. Lord Ashford was, as I have said, not a large man, but he had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He moved through his household with an air of ownership that extended to everything: the furniture, the dogs, the horses, the people, us. He was not deliberately cruel, I will grant him that. He did not abuse his servants for sport. But neither was he kind in any meaningful sense. We existed for him as functions, not as individuals. I served him directly on many occasions, standing at his elbow during meals, pouring his wine, bringing him water to wash his hands between courses. I watched him eat, watched him laugh with his guests, watched him conduct the business of his estates. He had an easy manner with his equals, a kind of casual confidence that came from never having questioned his right to be where he was, to have what he had. He never once looked at me in a way that suggested he saw a person. I was a pair of hands holding a ewer. I was a presence that performed necessary functions. When I did my work well, I was invisible. When I erred, I became briefly visible as a problem to be corrected, and then I returned to invisibility. Do you understand what this does to you? To be in someone's presence day after day, to serve their needs, to know intimate details of their life, and yet to never be acknowledged as a fellow human being. It creates a strange hollowness, a sense of being both present and absent at once. Lady Ashford was different, though not necessarily better. She was a handsome woman, tall and fair, with the kind of beauty that seemed almost cold in its perfection. She was conscious of her appearance in a way her husband was not, always dressed richly, her hair always arranged elaborately, her manner always composed. She was aware of servants in a way Lord Ashford was not, but this awareness was not kindness. She noticed when things were not to her liking. She noticed when a chamber was not quite clean enough, when a garment was not pressed quite perfectly, when service was a moment too slow. She would summon the chamberlain and make her displeasure known, and then we would suffer the consequences. Extra work, withheld rations, harsh words. But she could also be generous in her way. When her mood was good, she might give an old gown to a favoured maid. She might order extra food for the servant's meal. She might praise someone's work, though always through an intermediary, never directly. These gestures felt like crumbs from a rich table, and we were expected to be grateful for them. I think she saw herself as a good mistress, a benevolent manager of her household. I think she truly believed she was kind. This made her harder to understand than her husband, whose indifference was at least straightforward. The children were perhaps the most complicated to serve. The eldest son, Thomas, was being trained to take his father's place someday. He was a serious boy, given to long hours of study and practice at arms. He rarely spoke to servants, and when he did, it was always as commands, never as conversation. I had no quarrel with him. He was simply learning to be what his father was. The younger son, Edmund, was the one who had struck the laundress's daughter. He remained difficult throughout his youth, quick to anger, quick to punish, delighting in small cruelties. Perhaps he would grow out of it, perhaps he would not. Either way, we learned to avoid him when possible. The daughter, Alice, was the youngest, and in some ways the most troubling to me. She was kind, or she seemed to be. She would smile at servants, thank them for their service, ask after their health. And these gestures, which might have been welcome, instead felt uncomfortable because they did not change anything fundamental. She was still the lady. We were still servants. Her kindness was a performance, whether she knew it or not, a way of demonstrating her own virtue without costing her anything real. I remember once she saw me carrying a heavy load of wood and said, "Thomas, you should not have to carry so much." She knew my name, which surprised me. But then she simply walked on, and I continued carrying the wood and nothing changed. Her sympathy was meant to make her feel good, not to make my burden lighter. Beyond the immediate family, there were the guests, the visitors, the stream of nobles and knights and ladies who passed through the household. I served them all at various times, and they were all variations on the same theme, assured of their superiority, comfortable in their privilege, incapable of imagining life as we lived it. Some were worse than others. Some were openly contemptuous, speaking to servants as one might speak to animals. Some were simply oblivious, existing in their own world and barely registering our presence. A few were polite in a distant way, but even politeness had an edge to it, a reminder that they were being gracious and condescending to acknowledge us. I learned to read these people, to understand their moods and anticipate their needs. It was a survival skill. If you could sense when someone was in a foul temper, you could adjust your behavior accordingly, move more carefully, speak more softly, make yourself even more invisible. If you could recognize who was likely to be generous and who was likely to be harsh, you could sometimes maneuver to serve the former and avoid the latter. We talked about them, of course. In our quarters at night, in quiet moments in the kitchens, in whispered conversations while we worked. We traded observations, shared warnings, made cruel jokes that we would never have dared to speak aloud in their presence. We mocked their pretensions. We laughed at their follies. We noted their hypocrisies. The lord who preached about chastity while maintaining a mistress in the village. The lady who spoke of Christian charity while treating her servants like dirt. The knight who boasted of his honour while cheating at dice. These small rebellions of speech were important. They let us retain some sense of our own judgment, our own perspective. They reminded us that we saw them clearly, even if they did not see us at all. But here is the complicated truth. Even as we mocked them, even as we resented them, we were also in awe of them. Their world was so far beyond ours that it seemed almost magical. The richness of their clothes, the abundance of their food, the leisure they enjoyed, the education they received, the ease with which they moved through life, never worrying about hunger or cold or the basic necessities that consumed our every thought. And their connections, their network of relationships that stretched across the realm and beyond, letters arriving from distant places, visitors bringing news from court, marriages arranged to cement alliances, the whole complex dance of power and influence that they navigated as easily as we navigated the passages of their house. We were fascinated by it, even as we knew we would never be part of it. I remember once standing outside the Solar, waiting to be summoned with more wine, and overhearing a conversation about a tournament. The knights were discussing the finer points of jousting, debating which horses were best suited to the lists, arguing about techniques and strategies. Their voices were animated, excited, and I realized that this was their work, in a sense. This is what they trained for, what gave their lives meaning and structure, the pursuit of martial glory, the display of skill and courage. And I thought, my work is to serve them while they do theirs. My labour makes their leisure possible. Without us, there would be no tournaments, no feasts, no ease. We are the foundation on which their world rests. But did they ever think of this? Did it ever occur to them that their lives were made possible by ours? I do not believe it did. There was one moment, though, one brief moment, when I saw something like recognition in Lord Ashford's eyes. It was during a particularly harsh winter. The cold was severe, the food stores were running low, and there was sickness in the village. One of the older servants, a man named Martin who had worked in the household for 30 years, took ill with a fever. He grew worse quickly, and within days it was clear he would not recover. Robert the Chamberlain informed Lord Ashford of the situation. I was present, standing in the background, when this conversation took place. Lord Ashford listened, frowned, and then said something that surprised me. "Martin has served this house well. See that he is made comfortable. Give him a place by the fire and whatever food or drink he wishes." It was a small mercy, but it was something. Martin spent his last days in relative warmth and comfort, instead of suffering alone in the cold servants' quarters. When he passed, Lord Ashford paid for a priest to say prayers for his soul, and he was buried in the churchyard, not in an unmarked grave, but with a simple stone. I thought about this for a long time afterward. Was it kindness? Or was it simply the gesture of a man who understood that even tools, when they have served faithfully, deserve some acknowledgement at the end? I never resolved this question. Perhaps both were true. Every household has secrets. The larger the household, the more secrets it holds, and the more servants know them. You might think that those above us were careful about what they said and did in our presence. They were not. We were furniture to them, remember, and people say things in front of furniture that they would never say in front of witnesses. I learned very quickly that one of the most valuable skills a servant could have was selective deafness. You heard everything, but you acknowledged hearing nothing. You saw everything, but your face remained blank. You knew everything, but you spoke of it only among yourselves, in whispers, never where it might be overheard by those who could punish you for knowing. Some secrets were minor, petty disputes between family members, small deceptions, social rivalries. These we found amusing, small entertainments to lighten our labour. Some secrets were more serious, financial troubles, political machinations, correspondence that had to be kept confidential. These we treated with more care, understanding that knowledge of them could be dangerous, and some secrets were dark, the kind that sat heavy in your chest and made you complicit simply by knowing them. I will tell you one, because you should understand what it meant to carry such knowledge and be unable to speak of it. There was a girl named Margaret who worked in the household, daughter of one of the tenant farmers. She was perhaps 15 years old, quiet and hard-working, employed in the laundry. She had been there for about a year when I began to notice changes in her. She grew pale, she moved differently, she kept her arms wrapped around her middle when she thought no one was watching. The older women knew before I did what this meant. They whispered about it in corners, their faces grim. And they whispered too about who might be responsible, though no names were spoken aloud, only meaningful looks and careful silences. One day, Margaret was simply gone. We were told she had been sent home, that her father needed her help on the farm. But we all knew this was a lie. We knew what happened to girls in her condition, how they were removed quietly to spare the household any embarrassment, how they disappeared and were not spoken of again. I never learned what became of her. I never learned whether the child lived or whether she survived its birth. I never learned whether anyone took responsibility or whether she bore it alone. These questions had no answers, because to ask them would have been to acknowledge what had happened, and acknowledgement was impossible. This was not an uncommon story. It happened in households throughout the realm, I am certain. The powerful took what they wanted, and the powerless bore the consequences, and those of us who witnessed it learned to look away, to say nothing, to forget. But I never did forget. I carried that knowledge with me, and it changed something in how I saw the world. It clarified the truth that I had been learning gradually, that justice was not the same for all people, that sin was defined differently depending on who committed it, that protection existed only for those with power. There were other secrets too, less dark but still corrosive in their way. I knew about the debts Lord Ashford owed, because I sometimes carried letters to merchants and money lenders. I knew about the pressure he was under from larger lords, the careful balancing act he performed to maintain his position. I knew that the appearance of wealth and ease was sometimes just that, an appearance, maintained at great cost and with considerable anxiety. I knew about the disputes between Lord and Lady Ashford, because sound travels through stone walls, and we heard their raised voices even when they thought they were private. I knew about the alliances and enmities within the family, the favouritism shown to one child over another, the petty jealousies and resentments that existed even among those who had everything. I knew about the affairs, the discreet visits, the letters that were meant to be kept secret. I knew which knights were in love with which ladies, which marriages were happy and which were merely convenient arrangements, who was faithful and who was not. And I knew about the cruelty, both casual and deliberate, the servant who was dismissed for some minor error and left to beg, the tenant farmer whose rent was raised beyond what he could pay, leading to his family's ruin, the decisions made coldly, without regard for the suffering they would cause, because the suffering of the lowly did not weigh heavily in the scales of the great. We knew all of this, and we said nothing, because what could we say? To whom would we speak? Who would listen to servants? Our knowledge was worthless except as protection. If we knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak, we were less likely to be carelessly discarded. But even this protection was limited. Knowledge could make you valuable, but it could also make you dangerous. There were servants who were sent away simply because they knew too much, because their presence had become uncomfortable. So we learned to be careful. We learned to forget what we knew when it was convenient to forget. We learned to be blind and deaf when necessary. We learned to survive, but the secrets left their mark on us. They taught us cynicism, taught us that the noble virtues we heard preached in chapel were often merely words, that the distance between what people claimed to be and what they actually were could be vast. And yet, even knowing all this, we still served, we still bowed, we still said, "Yes, my lord," and "Yes, my lady," and performed our duties. Because we had no choice, yes, but also because we had been shaped by that life, moulded by it, until servitude was not just what we did, but part of what we were. This is perhaps the deepest secret of all, that service changes the servant, that over time you begin to internalize the hierarchy, to believe in some dim way that you deserve your lowness, that it is right and proper that you should kneel while others stand. I fought against this. I tried to maintain some core of self-respect, some kernel of resistance, but I cannot say I always succeeded. There were times when I caught myself thinking in their terms, measuring my worth by their standards, feeling grateful for small mercies that should not have been mercies at all but simple decency. This is what power does. It shapes not just the powerful, but those who live under power. It seeps into your bones until you cannot remember what it felt like to stand straight. Every servant has a moment when loyalty is tested, when the weight of servitude becomes almost too much to bear. Mine came in my 20th year, during a winter that was harsh even by the standards of harsh winters. The harvest had been poor that year. The Lord's rents were still collected in full, but there was less to collect, and what remained for the villagers was barely enough. By midwinter, people were hungry. We heard reports from those who went to the village, children with hollow cheeks, old people growing weak, a desperate thin quality to life that made everyone afraid. In the household, we were better off than the villagers, but not by much. Our rations were reduced. The bread was stretched with whatever could be added to it. The pottage grew thinner. We went to bed hungry more often than not, and woke hungry and worked hungry, until hunger became a constant companion, an ache that never quite left. Meanwhile, in the great hall, the family continued to feast. Oh, the meals were less lavish than usual, I grant you that. But there was still meat, still fine bread, still wine and ale. They did not starve. They did not even go truly hungry. They merely experienced slightly less abundance. I served at table during this time, as I often did, and I watched them eat. I watched Lord Ashford cut into a roasted capon and eat his fill. I watched Lady Ashford pick daintily at her food, leaving half of it on her plate. I watched the children complain about the quality of the bread, which was finer than anything we servants would taste that month, and I felt something building inside me, something hot and bitter and dangerous. One evening, after the family had finished their meal, I was helping to clear the table. There was so much food left over, so much that would go to waste or be fed to the dogs. A whole fish barely touched. Bread, cheese, things that would have kept a family alive for days. As I carried a platter back toward the kitchen, I passed through a passage where no one could see me, and I stopped. I looked down at the food in my hands and I thought, I could eat this, right now. I could fill my belly for once. Who would know? But I did not do it. Not because I was not tempted, but because I knew the consequences if I were caught. Stealing food was grounds for immediate dismissal, possibly worse. And where would I go in the middle of winter with no position and no references? So I carried the platter to the kitchen and watched as the food was scraped away, and I hated myself for my cowardice, and I hated them for creating a world where eating food that would otherwise be wasted was a crime. That night, lying on my pallet, I whispered to William, "Is this right? That they feast while we starve, that there is abundance enough for all, but they keep it for themselves?" William was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Right has nothing to do with it. This is the way things are." "But why?" I asked. "Why must it be this way?" "Because they have the power," William said, "and we do not. That is all. That is everything." I wanted to argue with him, to say that there must be more to it than that there must be some moral order, some justice, but I could not find the words, because I knew he was right. The next day, a boy from the village came to the gate, begging for food. He was perhaps 8 years old, thin as a stick, his eyes huge in his gaunt face. The gatekeeper turned him away. This was policy. The household did not give to beggars, because if you gave to one, more would come, and where would it end? I watched this happen from across the courtyard. I watched the boy turn away, stumbling a little as he walked, and I thought about the food we had thrown away the night before, about the abundance that was denied to those who needed it most. That was my breaking point. Not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small cruelties, small injustices, small moments of recognizing the deep wrongness of the world I inhabited. But what could I do with this knowledge? Nothing. I had no power to change anything. I could not feed the hungry or challenge the unjust or remake the world according to better principles. I could only continue serving, continue bowing, continue pretending that this was the natural order of things, unless I left. The thought came to me suddenly, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. I could leave, I could walk away from this life, find something else, somewhere else. I was young still, strong, capable. Surely there were other possibilities. I thought about this for weeks. I lay awake at night imagining different lives, working as a free labourer in a town, learning a trade, perhaps even saving enough to rent a small piece of land. The possibilities seemed infinite, glorious, but slowly reality intruded. Where would I go? How would I survive the journey? What would I do for food and shelter? Who would employ me without references? How would I explain why I'd left my position? And beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper fear. I had spent 6 years in service. It had shaped me. I knew how to be a servant, but I no longer knew how to be anything else. The thought of leaving was the thought of stepping off a cliff into darkness, with no certainty of what lay below. One morning, I went to Robert the Chamberlain and asked to speak with him privately. He granted me a few moments, his face impassive. I told him that I wished to leave service, to seek my fortune elsewhere. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You are free to go, of course, but you should understand what you are giving up. You have a position here. You have food and shelter, however modest. You have protection. Out there, you would have nothing." "I would have my freedom," I said. He smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Freedom to starve, freedom to freeze, freedom to be preyed upon by those stronger than you. Is that what you want?" I did not answer. "You are young," he continued. You think the world beyond these walls is better than it is. I assure you, it is not. There are men who would exploit you far more cruelly than we do. There are hardships far worse than the ones you endure here. You have a good position. You are fed. You are clothed. You are learning skills that could lead to advancement. Why would you throw this away? And the terrible thing was, he was right. Or at least, I could not prove he was wrong. I had no evidence that life outside would be better. I had only my resentment, my anger, my sense that something was deeply wrong with a world where some had so much and others so little. But resentment is not a plan. Anger is not a future. I thanked Robert for his counsel and withdrew, and I stayed. I continued in my service. I did not leave. And this, I think, was the true breaking. Not the moment when I considered leaving, but the moment when I chose to stay, knowing what I knew, feeling what I felt, and still bowing my head and returning to my duties. That choice broke something in me. Some possibility died. I had looked at the door and chosen not to walk through it, and afterward the door seemed to close permanently. I was a servant, and I would remain a servant, and that was simply the truth of my life. I tried to make peace with this. I tried to find meaning in the work itself, in doing it well, in the small satisfactions that came from competence, and to some extent I succeeded. I continued to rise in the household. Within a few years I became Robert's assistant, learning the complex business of managing the household's accounts and supplies. When Robert grew old and retired, I took his place as chamberlain. I had achieved a position of relative authority and comfort. Other servants answered to me now. I was trusted. I was valued, in the limited way that servants could be valued. But I never forgot that winter, and the boy at the gate, and the choice I had made. I never forgot what it felt like to see clearly the injustice of the world, and to choose to remain part of it anyway, because the alternative seemed too frightening, too uncertain. We are all complicit in the end. Those of us who serve the unjust system, who benefit from it even in our lowness, who keep it running with our labour and our obedience, we are not innocent, we are part of the machinery. This knowledge is a burden I have carried ever since. I am old now, far older than I ever expected to become. I served the Ashford household for 42 years, from youth to age, until my body could no longer perform the duties required of it. When I retired, I was given a small pension and a room in the village, and here I sit now, in the dimness of failing sight and the quiet of failing hearing, thinking back across the years. What do I remember most? Not the grand moments, the feasts and ceremonies and noble visitors. Those have blurred together into a general impression of silk and silver and candlelight. What I remember are the small things, the weight of a water jug in my hands, the smell of bread baking in the early morning, the sound of Agnes's voice scolding someone in the kitchen, the ache in my knees after a long day, the warmth of the fire after hours in the cold. I remember faces. William, who taught me how to survive those early years, and who died of a fever at 30. Peter, sent home weak and never heard from again. Agnes, who ruled the kitchen for 20 years, and then was replaced by someone younger when her hands grew too stiff to work. Martin, dying by the fire. Margaret disappeared. All the others, the scores of servants who passed through that household, who worked and suffered and endured, and then were gone, leaving barely a trace. We were invisible in life. We are more invisible still in memory. No one writes histories of servants. No one records our names or our struggles or our small victories. We are the ghosts that haunt the margins of greater stories, present but unacknowledged. And what of the family I served? Lord Ashford died 15 years before I retired, grown old and feeble, and his son Thomas took his place. Lady Ashford lived longer, a frail, ancient woman at the end, tended by servants she no longer recognised. The children grew and married and had children of their own, and the cycle continued. Did they ever think of us? Did they ever wonder about the lives we lived, the thoughts we thought, the dreams we might have had? I do not believe so. We remained for them what we had always been. Functions, not people. Necessary, perhaps, but not real in the way they were real. And here is what I have come to understand in my old age. They were prisoners too, in their way. Not prisoners of poverty or labour or hunger, obviously, but prisoners of their position, of the expectations placed upon them, of the need to maintain their status and power. They could not befriend us, could not see us as equals, because to do so would have been to undermine the entire structure that gave their lives meaning. They needed us to be beneath them so that they could be above us. Our lowness was necessary for their height. This does not excuse them. It does not make their actions right or their indifference acceptable. But it helps me understand that the system trapped us all, high and low, in roles we did not choose and could not escape. Lord Ashford was born to be a lord. He never questioned it, never imagined being anything else. His world was as constrained as mine, only in different ways. He could not do certain kinds of work, could not marry where he pleased, could not choose a different life without losing everything that made him who he was. And so he lived as he had to live, and we lived as we had to live, and the distance between us remained unbridgeable. I spent my life resenting that distance. I spent my life feeling the unfairness of it, the arbitrary nature of birth and station, the cruelty of a world that gave so much to some and so little to others. And I was right to feel these things. The resentment was justified. But I also wasted energy on that resentment, energy that might have been spent on other things, finding joy where I could, building real connections with those around me, creating something of value within the constraints of my life. I did some of that. I had friendships, moments of laughter, small pleasures. But I could have had more if I had been less consumed by anger at what I could not change. This is not to say I should have been content with servitude. I should not. No one should be content with injustice. But perhaps I could have found a better balance between resistance and acceptance, between fighting what was wrong and living as well as I could within it. Do I regret my life? This is a complicated question. I regret the system that made my life what it was. I regret the casual cruelty, the indifference, the way human beings were treated as less than human. I regret the waste of potential, of talent, of lives that might have been so much more than they were allowed to be. But do I regret the life itself, the actual days I lived? Not entirely. There was hardship, yes, but there was also camaraderie and small kindnesses, and the satisfaction of work well done. There was beauty in the world, even in service, a perfect spring morning, a well-ordered household, the grace of doing something difficult and doing it well. And there was learning. I learned patience, which I had not had as a boy. I learned to read people, to understand motives and fears and desires. I learned the complex workings of a large household, the intricate web of relationships and dependencies. I learned how power functions, how it is maintained, how it shapes those who hold it and those who do not. These are not lessons I would have chosen to learn, but they are valuable nonetheless. If I could go back, knowing what I know now, would I make different choices? Would I leave when I had the chance? I do not know. Perhaps I would. Perhaps I would find the courage to walk through that door, to risk the uncertainty beyond it. Perhaps I would discover that there was another life possible, a better life. Or perhaps I would make the same choice again, because fear and practical necessity would still weigh as heavily as they did then. What I do know is this: no one's life is wasted if they lived it with attention, if they tried to understand what was happening to them and around them, if they maintained some core of self despite the pressures to conform and submit. I tried to do that. I did not always succeed, but I tried. And now, at the end, I find myself thinking not about the lords I served, but about the other servants, the people I worked alongside, the ones who shared my burden and understood my struggles without needing to be told. I think about William, teaching me to care for horses with a gentleness that contradicted his rough exterior. I think about Agnes, saving me bits of food when she could, showing kindness in the only way she knew how. I think about the young servants I later supervised, and how I tried to be less harsh with them than others had been with me, though I'm sure I often failed. These were my people. These were the ones who mattered. We survived together, and that survival, however compromised, however difficult, was worth something. You ask what medieval servants really thought of their lords. We thought many things, often contradictory. We admired and resented them. We envied and pitied them. We feared them, and sometimes we felt a sort of affection for them, the way you might feel affection for a difficult master who nonetheless provides for you. But mostly, I think, we did not think about them as much as they would have assumed. They were the facts of our existence, like the weather or the seasons, powerful, unavoidable, but not the centre of our inner lives. We thought about our own struggles, our own relationships, our own small hopes and fears. We thought about the work we had to do and the lives we were trying to live within the narrow boundaries available to us. They thought we existed for them. In truth, they were merely the circumstances within which we existed. We had our own lives, however constrained. We had our own dignity, however unacknowledged. We had our own worth, however unrecognized. This is what I want you to understand. We were not just servants, we were people. We laughed and wept and loved and hated and dreamed and despaired. We were as human as those we served, possessing the same capacity for thought and feeling and moral judgment. The great injustice was not that we worked while they rested. Work is honourable. The great injustice was that they could not see our humanity, and the system encouraged them not to see it, because to see it would have made their position untenable. How can you in good conscience live in luxury, while those who make your luxury possible live in want? How can you enjoy leisure that is purchased by others' labour without acknowledging the debt? How can you claim superiority over those who are your equals in every way that truly matters? You cannot, and so they did not see. They looked at us and saw servants, not people. They looked at us and saw functions, not souls, and we looked at them and saw our masters, but we also saw something else. We saw the hollowness at the heart of their superiority, the emptiness of power without purpose, the loneliness of elevation without connection. They had everything and were satisfied with nothing. We had almost nothing and found ways to be satisfied anyway, because we had to, because the alternative was despair. In the end, perhaps that is the truest thing I can say. They were not happier than us. They were not more content. They did not live better lives in any way that actually matters. They had more comfort, yes, and more security, and more pleasure. But they did not have more joy, more love, more meaning. They were, in their way, as trapped as we were, trapped by the need to maintain their status, to live up to expectations, to perform their role in the great drama of hierarchy and power. They could not be themselves any more than we could. We were all servants to something, they to their pride and position, we to our survival and their whims. None of us were free. This is what I have learned in my 70 years, that freedom is rare, that most of us live constrained by circumstances we did not choose and cannot change, that the question is not whether we are free but how we live within our unfreedom. Some live with bitterness, letting resentment poison every day. Some live with obsequiousness, surrendering dignity for small favours. Some live with rebellion, fighting until they are broken. I tried to live with clear sight, to see the world as it was, without either accepting it as right or being destroyed by its wrongness. I tried to maintain my humanity in a system that denied it. I tried to be kind where I could, to do my work well, to treat those below me better than I was treated, to remember always that I was a person, not just a function. I do not know if I succeeded. I leave that judgment to others if there are any who care to make it. But I can say this: I survived, I endured, and I remained myself, however battered that self became, however changed by the years and the labour and the 1,000 small submissions that service required. The walls of Ashford Hall still stand. I can see them from my window, rising dark against the sky. The house continues. There is a new lord now, Lord Thomas's son, and new servants working in the kitchens and halls and chambers. The cycle continues as it has for generations, as it will for generations more. But those walls remember, even if the people do not. They remember all of us who passed through them, lords and ladies, servants and slaves, the high and the low, the powerful and the powerless. We all left our marks, invisible but indelible, in the stone and wood and air of that place. We were there, we lived, we mattered, whether anyone acknowledged it or not, and someday, perhaps, the world will change. Perhaps there will come a time when service does not mean servitude, when labour is honoured rather than despised, when all people are seen as people regardless of birth or station. I will not live to see that day, but I believe it will come, because I have to believe it, because the alternative is to accept that all the suffering and struggle meant nothing, led nowhere, changed nothing. The world is unjust. But injustice is not inevitable. It is made by human choices, and it can be unmade by human choices. Those who come after us might choose differently, might build something better. That is my hope. That is what I leave to those who come after. The hope that you will see more clearly than we did, fight more bravely than we could, create a world where no one must bow, where no one must live invisible, where every person is granted the dignity that is their birthright. We could not do this, but perhaps you can. The light is fading now, both outside my window and behind my eyes. My time is ending. Soon I will join all the other forgotten servants, the nameless ones who laboured and died, and left no trace beyond the work of their hands, which has long since been washed away. But I have written this, however poorly, however inadequately. I have set down what I remember, what I learned, what I understood. Perhaps someone will read it. Perhaps someone will know for a moment what it was like to live that life. We were there, in the shadow of power, in the invisible places, doing the work that kept the world turning. We were there, and we were human, and we mattered. Remember us.